December 22nd, 2013, late afternoon, inside a betting hall built decades earlier by movie studio money, a woman named Naomi Filburn stands behind a bar named for a horse trainer. She is pouring one more round of drinks. She has stood at that same bar for 28 years. Tonight is her last shift, and it is not her choice. The company shutting the doors around her is transferring the workers with more seniority to a track across the city. Filburn does not have the years on the list. She is going home with nothing lined up. She already knows what she plans to tell anyone who asks what comes next. She is going to pound the pavement, she says. That is what she gets for marrying good-looking instead of rich. She keeps wiping the bar as she says it, not looking up. Around her, the room is filling for the last time, and every face at the counter already knows the schedule she is on. None of them can do anything about it either. The room she has poured drinks in for 28 years is closing on a schedule that was set long before she noticed. 30 years before that shift, the same building held 34,000 people on a good day, watching a California-bred horse named Native Diver win 3 straight Hollywood Gold Cups. When Native Diver died in 1967, the track buried him under the walking ring outside, the only racehorse in California ever laid to rest on the grounds where he raced. The company that owned Hollywood Park in 2013 had never trained a horse or sold a betting ticket in its life. It was a real estate investment firm, and 8 years earlier, when it signed the papers to buy this track, it had already converted one shuttered California racetrack into houses, using the identical method it was about to use here. Racing at Hollywood Park was allowed to continue for exactly as long as the purchase contract required, and not one day longer. The track's president explained the decision as plainly as anyone in this story ever will. From an economic point of view, he said, the land now simply had a higher and better use. Within 2 years, the walking ring where Native Diver had rested since 1967 would be gone too, and his owners would have to dig him up and move him before the machinery reached that end of the property. That part comes later. 7 years after Filburn's last shift, a $5.5 billion football stadium opened on the same acreage, home to 2 NFL teams that had not even existed in Los Angeles when she started pouring drinks there. Almost nobody who walks into that stadium today knows a racetrack was ever underneath it. None of it. The closing shift, the horse moved out of the ground, the stadium that replaced all of it, means anything without the 75 years that came before. In 1938, this was not real estate. It was the strangest bet a group of movie studio executives ever placed on a sport that had nothing to do with the movies. The men who placed it ran the studios up the road. Before 1938, the parcel in Inglewood was ordinary Southern California scrubland, a few miles from a small municipal airfield nobody yet called an airport of consequence. The Hollywood Turf Club, organized under the Warner Brothers, sold shares to roughly 600 people, mostly from the film industry, everyone from Bing Crosby to the actress Joan Blondell, and by the time it opened, Al Jolson and the director Raoul Walsh sat on its founding board. The track they built was designed by an architect named Arthur Freilich, and it opened on June 10, 1938, with a grandstand meant to look, on purpose, like it belonged to the same people who built movie sets for a living. It did not stay a curiosity for long. On July 16, 1938, barely a month after opening, Hollywood Park ran its first Hollywood Gold Cup, and the horse that won it was Seabiscuit, carrying 133 pounds under jockey George Wolfe, beating a field that included stagehand by a length and a half. Footage of that real race was cut into a Wallace Beery picture called Stablemates, released the same year, so audiences who never set foot in Inglewood watched the actual finish from a Hollywood Park photo unit inside a movie theater. The track that had opened as a studio executive's hobby had, in 5 weeks, produced a national sports story with its own place in a film. The run did not go untouched. The track closed from 1942 to 1944, requisitioned as a storage facility for North American aviation during the war, and reopened afterward running charity race days for the war effort before returning to a normal calendar. Then, on the night of May 5, 1949, a fire broke out in the grandstand. Airline pilots on approach to the airport down the road spotted the glow first. A night watchman on the upper deck saw it seconds later. Fresh paint on the stands helped the flames along. The wooden roof and benches burned through, and the metal grandstand structure buckled and came down while people gathered in the streets outside to watch it go. The fire took a clubhouse renovation that had cost close to $1 million and had only just been finished. It was, by any measure, the kind of loss that ends a business. The Hollywood Turf Club rebuilt anyway, spending through a second construction project inside a decade to put the grandstand back exactly where the fire had taken it, and the track reopened in 1950. It would not close again for 63 years, until the day a different kind of company decided it should. By 1951, Hollywood Park had become the track where American racing crossed a threshold nobody in the sport had crossed before. That summer, Citation, owned by Calumet Farm under Warren Wright, won the Hollywood Gold Cup for his 22nd stakes victory, and with it became the first horse in the history of the sport to earn over $1 million, finishing with career earnings just over $1,085,000. Wright had reportedly kept Citation running specifically until the horse crossed that number. Once he did, Citation retired, and the record stood as the loudest proof yet that the track built by movie people could produce the biggest moments in the sport itself. The employees who worked there for decades afterward called it something else entirely. They called it the track of the lakes and flowers, for the ornamental water and landscaping built into the infield. And by the 1960s, it was drawing crowds that, according to later retrospectives, ran as high as 34,000 people on a single day. A California-bred colt named Native Diver was one of the reasons. He won the Hollywood Gold Cup 3 years running, from 1965 through 1967, the first California-bred horse to pass $1 million in career earnings. And when he died of colic later in 1967, the track did something it had never done for any other horse. It buried him inside the walking ring, in view of the grandstand, and the grave became a fixture people visited for decades, long after most of the crowds who had watched him run were gone themselves. The track's other constant through those decades was a partnership between a trainer named Charlie Whittingham, known in the sport as the Bald Eagle, and a jockey named Bill Shoemaker. Whittingham trained for nearly 50 years and won 2,533 races, more of them with Shoemaker in the saddle than with any other rider. And together, they turned Hollywood Park into the place where California racing's biggest partnerships were built and proven. On a good Saturday in those years, the walking ring outside the grandstand filled before every stakes race with the same ritual. Whittingham would stand at the rail in a windbreaker, saying almost nothing, while Shoemaker swung up light as a boy despite riding into his 50s, and Harry Henson's voice carried the field into the stretch over speakers bolted to a clubhouse that still had turf club members drinking at tables their parents had held decades earlier. In 1972, a trainer named Tom Proctor watched his father run a horse called Convenience against a filly named Typecast in a match race there that people were still talking about decades later. Proctor himself started working the same track 6 years after that and stayed until it closed, telling a reporter near the end that the place was his life. In 1981, a gelding named John Henry, trained by Ron McAnally, won the Hollywood Invitational, and the track ran a race named for him every year from 1986 through 1994. A longtime track announcer named Harry Henson called races there from 1959 until his retirement in 1982. His voice the sound that told a Hollywood Park crowd whether the horse they had bet on was winning. A bartender named Nola Ferraro poured drinks at Hollywood Park for 41 years, the first woman ever to tend bar at a Southern California racetrack. When the company decided who to keep and who to let go, decades before it made that same decision about Filburn, it moved Ferraro down the road to Santa Anita instead of laying her off. She still mourned what she left behind, telling a reporter the lakes and the outdoor views were the parts she missed most. A parimutuel clerk named Ronnie McClellan worked the windows for 44 years and called it, like all the old employees did, the track of the lakes and flowers. A horse player named Jimmy the Hat Allard hit the track's 6-race pick-6 wager more than 200 times across 27 years, and the columnist Jay Hovde wrote that its real character was a long stretch of sunny afternoons and a guaranteed lineup of stars even on a Thursday. The novelist Charles Bukowski used the track as a setting for decades, giving his fictional stand-in, a heavy drinking bettor named Henry Chinaski, the same habit he had himself. Film and television crews kept showing up too, across 5 decades, using the real grandstand and the real paddock as a location for everything from network detective shows to studio comedies. Because the track that movie money had built in 1938 never fully stopped looking like a set. That bar Filburn worked at for 28 years had a name too. Employees called it Whittingham's Pub, after the trainer, and it sat in the same building where the turf club crowd had been drinking since the 1940s. What none of the people drinking there through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s could have known was that the ground under their feet was never actually going to belong to horse racing forever. It belonged on paper to a company, and a company can decide a sport is done with a signature, the same way it decided to start one. The signature came slowly, and the first cracks showed up as numbers on a balance sheet rather than headlines. A racing and casino executive named Marje Everett joined the Hollywood Park Board in 1972 and became its chief executive in 1985. She had run this playbook before. In 1968, she had sold her own track, Arlington Park outside Chicago, to a conglomerate called Gulf and Western, and she arrived at Hollywood Park already understanding that a racetrack's real value and its ticket sales were not the same thing. Under her, by the late 1980s, the company was reportedly close to bankruptcy. By June of 1987, auditors found the track had breached the terms of a $70 million loan it had taken out in 1984, the result of years of negative cash flow driven by roughly a 30% attendance decline through the decade. Here is what was actually happening to the track's money. A racetrack earns its share from the total amount wagered on its own grounds, not simply from who walks through the gate, and every dollar bet at a new off-track parlor instead of at a Hollywood Park window was a dollar the track never touched. A new state lottery gave Californians an even simpler way to gamble than driving to Inglewood at all. A track that had spent 50 years as the place movie stars and horse players wanted to be seen was now a company failing to make its loan payments. Whittingham's pub kept pouring drinks the whole time this was happening, and Filburn was still behind it, years away from the night nobody would warn her the schedule was about to change. Everett did not survive the fallout. In April of 1991, an investor named R.D. Hubbard bought a stake in the company, and alongside shareholders Tom Gamble and Harry Ornest, forced Everett out of control of the business she had run for 6 years. It was a boardroom fight rather than a public one, fought through proxy votes and stock purchases rather than headlines, and by the time it was finished, the woman who had once sold her own Chicago track for a profit was on the outside of the company she had spent 2 decades building. Hubbard's management invested $20 million into track improvements that same year, and by the following year, Hollywood Park posted its first profit in 5 years. Despite riots that tore through large parts of Los Angeles in 1992, the track's annual profits that year reached $5,400,000. On paper, the crisis looked solved. It was solved the way a company solves a cash flow problem, not the way a sport survives. In the summer of 1994, Hollywood Park opened a casino on its own grounds, the first in the United States built inside an operating racetrack, part of a $100 million expansion that let bettors move between the Perry Mutual windows and a card room without leaving the property. California law at the time barred a publicly traded company from directly operating a card club, on the theory that gambling licenses needed a person the state could hold responsible, not a stock ticker. So a separate firm ran the casino floor on Hollywood Park's behalf for a year, while Hollywood Park itself lobbied Sacramento to change that law, which lawmakers did in 1995, and Hollywood Park took the operation over directly the moment the law allowed it. The same year the casino opened, the company bought an Arizona track, Turf Paradise, for $34 million in stock, and 2 years after that, it opened a second card club, Crystal Park, in Compton. None of the diversification held. The company lost money through 1995 and 1996 anyway, then spent $188 million buying a casino operator called Boomtown, which merged into a larger gaming company 2 years later. Every one of these moves, the Arizona track, the Compton Card Club, the casino operator, was a bet that Hollywood Park's future was in gambling generally rather than horse racing specifically, and every one of them failed to fix the thing that was actually wrong, which was that a single aging racetrack in a built-up city was worth more as almost anything else. On September 10, 1999, Churchill Downs Incorporated bought what was left of Hollywood Park outright for $140 million. And for the first time in 61 years, the storied California track belonged to an out-of-state corporation with no connection to the studios that had built it. That ownership change meant one thing above all else. The track's future no longer belonged to anyone who loved horse racing, or Los Angeles, or even gambling as a business. It belonged to whoever Churchill Downs decided to sell it to next. And on July 6, 2005, Churchill Downs announced exactly that. The buyer was Bay Meadows Land Company, a subsidiary of a real estate investment firm called Stockbridge Capital Group, founded 2 years earlier and led by Terry Fancher and a partner. The agreed price was $260 million in cash, and the sale closed that September at a slightly reduced $257.5 million. As part of the deal, Bay Meadows Land Company agreed to keep racing running for a minimum of 3 years and to spend $5 million on capital repairs, after which it would be free to redevelop the site however it chose. That contract language was not boilerplate. It was the entire plan, written down in advance. Stockbridge's subsidiary was named after a racetrack for a reason. Bay Meadows, a thoroughbred track in San Mateo, was the property the company had already begun converting into roughly 1,100 homes and millions of square feet of office and housing space, a conversion that finished emptying the track of racing entirely by May of 2008, 3 years after the same company bought Hollywood Park. The firm was not guessing at a business model when it signed for Hollywood Park. It was running the second half of a plan it had already started on a different California track, and it had structured the purchase contract so that racing was a temporary condition of ownership, not a promise to keep it running. A company like Stockbridge is not built to run a casino or a card room or collect a $200 window bet on the third race. It is built to hold a large, single-owner parcel inside a built-up city for exactly as long as it takes to get that parcel rezoned, entitled, and approved for something denser, collecting whatever operating income the existing use throws off while the approvals grind through City Hall. Racing at Hollywood Park was never the business. Racing was the holding pattern. None of this said anything yet about the horse still buried under the walking ring, but the same contract that ended racing would eventually reach him too. It would be unfair to pretend the track's own numbers gave Stockbridge nothing to work with. Attendance really had been sliding for 2 decades before the sale closed. Off-track wagering and the state lottery really had pulled bettors away from Inglewood, and horse racing nationally was already losing ground to other forms of gambling long before any land company signed anything. None of that decline is what closed Hollywood Park, though. A racetrack losing customers is a business problem, and business problems get solved or they do not. What closed Hollywood Park was a decision made in 2005, before the worst of that decline had even arrived, to treat the eventual closure as a foregone conclusion and structure a legal contract around it. The attendance numbers gave the company cover. They did not give it the idea. For a few more years, none of that showed on the surface. In 2010, the Oak Tree Racing Association, previously based at Santa Anita, held its first meet at Hollywood Park. In March of 2012, the track signed a naming rights deal with an online betting exchange called Betfair, and for its final years, the marquee read, Betfair Hollywood Park. Behind both moves sat a business fact nobody at the betting windows could see. California voters had already closed off the one path that might have let the track compete for its own land's value on the state's terms. In November of 2004, months before the Stockbridge sale, California voters rejected Proposition 68, a measure that would have let racetracks and card clubs install up to 30,000 slot machines if tribal casinos refused to share a quarter of their gross revenue with the state. Track and card club backers had abandoned their own campaign after tribal casino money funded the opposition, and voters killed the measure 84% to 16%. The fight had never really been about horse racing at all. It was 2 different kinds of California gambling money, tribal casinos on one side and racetracks and card clubs on the other, arguing over who got to keep the state's slot machine business, and the tracks lost decisively. Slot machines might have let Hollywood Park generate casino-level revenue on its own footprint, competing for the land's value the way a business competes, by earning it. With that option gone, the only value left in 260 acres of Inglewood was the value of the dirt itself, and the company that had just bought the track already knew exactly how to unlock it. Average daily attendance during the summer meet, which had run as high as 34,000 a day at the track's peak, had fallen for all but 7 of the previous 30 years, and reached roughly 3,775 by 2013, a decline of close to 90% from the crowds native diver used to draw. On May 9th of that year, Hollywood Park's president, a man named F. Jack Liebau, sent out the letter that ended it. Racing, he wrote, would not continue past the fall meet already underway. He noted the track had lasted longer than anyone had expected it to. Then he gave the same explanation this film opened with, in almost the same words, because by 2013, it was simply the plain truth as the company understood it. Nobody set out to kill Hollywood Park. A company bought it in 2005, already owning the plan to end it, wrote the ending into the purchase contract before a single more race was run, and then waited 8 years for the calendar and the numbers to catch up to a decision that had already been made. The end, when it came, still had a last day, and it belonged to the people who had spent their working lives there, not to the balance sheet. On December 22, 2013, gates opened free to the public after 2 in the afternoon, and roughly 13,000 people came through them, about double a normal weekend's paid crowd. Nobody who came that afternoon was betting seriously. They walked the paddock, stood at the rail where native diver's grave had sat for decades, and treated the last card of 6 races less like a day at the track and more like a wake with a tote board attached. Backstretch workers, many of them Latino families who had lived for years in the cinder block apartments built into the barn area, had already begun preparing to leave along with the horses they groomed and walked every morning before dawn. Training at Hollywood Park would end formally on January 31, 2014, with most of the horses and staff moving to Los Alamitos, which built new stabling for 500 thoroughbreds to absorb them. Nobody wrote a closure letter for the grooms and hot walkers the way the president wrote one for the shareholders. They simply packed the same cinder block rooms they had lived in for years and followed the horses to wherever the horses were going next. A valet named Joe Farron, who had taken what he thought was a one-day parking job there more than 40 years earlier and stayed, had spent those decades parking cars for Bob Newhart, John Forsythe, and Elizabeth Taylor, among many others, and was photographed on his last day in his uniform, his face pale with sunscreen he had not rubbed in all the way. Naomi Filburn, behind the bar at Whittingham's pub, was already telling people she planned to pound the pavement. The final race went off at 6:11 that evening, a $25,000 starter allowance race called the Old Lang Syne, run over 1 1/16 miles on the turf for a $57,750 purse. A horse named Woodman's Luck, ridden by jockey Corey Naka Tani and trained by Vladimir Serene, won it by a nose over a horse called Depreciable, with Dan Derrick finishing third. The track's veteran announcer made the call that closed out 75 years in one sentence. "A photo finish," he said. 75 years came down to a camera close-up. Then he added the line that would be quoted in nearly every story written about that day. 75 years at Hollywood Park, he said. That's a wrap. Native diver's grave did not survive the demolition that followed. Before the machinery reached the walking ring, the horse's owners, the Shapiro family, arranged to have his remains exhumed, reportedly found in close to perfect condition after more than 45 years in the ground, and reburied in the infield at Del Mar, on the California coast 100 miles south. A racehorse who had spent his whole career being paraded past a grandstand full of people ended up moved because the ground he was buried in had become worth more empty than it had ever been worth full. Demolition moved fast once it started. Early in 2014, Walmart sold a vacant 60-acre parcel next to the track to Stan Kroenke, the owner of the NFL's St. Louis Rams, who announced plans for a stadium on the combined site and the possibility of bringing his team back to Los Angeles. In January of 2015, Stockbridge and the Rams owners' company formalized a joint venture called Hollywood Park Land Company, folding the stadium project into the same redevelopment that was already tearing up the racetrack. Inglewood City Council approved plans for a roughly 70,000-seat stadium the following month, unanimously, and without the kind of fight that had taken years at other proposed NFL sites around Los Angeles. The land was already assembled, already zoned for exactly this kind of density, already owned by a joint venture built for the purpose. The stadium did not have to win an argument the racetrack's owners had already won for it a decade earlier. Then, at 5:59 in the morning on May 31, 2015, the historic grandstand came down in a series of planned detonations, starting at the south end and moving north. The building where Citation had crossed $1 million and where Naomi Filburn had poured her last drink reduced to rubble in a few seconds of camera footage. On January 12, 2016, NFL owners voted 30-2 to approve the Rams' move from St. Louis back to Los Angeles to play at the stadium being built on the old track's footprint. Construction broke ground 10 months later on November 17, 2016, with a projected cost of around $2.6 billion. By the time it was finished, the number had grown to roughly $5.5 billion, making it at the time the most expensive sports venue ever built anywhere in the world. In September of 2020, SoFi Stadium opened as the shared home of the Rams and a second relocated franchise, the Los Angeles Chargers, on the exact acreage where native diver had once been buried in a walking ring nobody now remembers standing in. The casino is the one piece of Hollywood Park that never actually left. A new building carrying the same name, Hollywood Park Casino, opened nearby in October of 2016, built in the same Art Deco style as the original and standing on West Century Boulevard, close to but not on top of where the racetrack once stood. Around it, developers have continued building out roughly 300 acres of the old racetrack grounds into thousands of housing units, office space, a retail district, and a 12-acre lake feature the marketing materials called Lake Park, along with the 6,000-seat YouTube theater, and as of 2026, all of it remained under construction. According to a report tied to the 2022 Super Bowl, the ground where Zenyatta, an undefeated mare trained by a Marine veteran named John Sheriffs, once lived in a barn with palm trees and a lawn the size of a hockey rink, is now part of SoFi Stadium's parking lot. Her trainer remembered walking her down a dirt path lined with trees to reach the track each morning, calling it peaceful, and said plainly that he was sad when the place came down. No marker on that lot notes what the ground used to hold. Doug O'Neill, a two-time Kentucky Derby winning trainer who had spent 3 or 4 months of every year of his career at Hollywood Park, went back to look after Demolition began and called it disorienting. "It's a big void for all of us," he said. Hollywood Park did not close because horse racing failed in Southern California, or because the sport ran out of fans, or because the land was needed for something the city could not have built any other way. It closed because in 2005, a real estate company bought 260 acres of Inglewood, already knowing, from its own recent history at a different California track, exactly what that land was going to become, and it wrote a contract that let racing continue for exactly as long as it had to, and not one day more. Walk the site today, and the racetrack is gone in every direction that matters. Where the grandstand stood, there is a stadium that cost more to build than the entire track sold for twice over. Where the walking ring held a dead horse for 45 years, there is a parking lot with no sign, and a stranger paying to park there during a Super Bowl has no way of knowing what the asphalt is sitting on. Where Whittingham's pub poured drinks for 70 years, there is nothing standing at all, though a casino carrying the track's old name still operates a short walk away, open under new construction and a new roof. The single piece of the Hollywood Park name that survived its own demolition. Around all of it, cranes are still finishing the housing, the offices, and the lake feature a developer's marketing materials describe as one of the largest mixed-use projects under construction anywhere in the western United States, on ground that a horse once ran across for a $50,000 purse. The casino name is still there. Native Diver is still buried, just not here, 100 miles down the coast at Del Mar, in ground his owners chose instead of ground a company decided it needed back. The stadium is still standing on the spot where 34,000 people once watched horses run for a purse, and it is worth, by the numbers alone, more than 20 times what Hollywood Park sold for the year the company that ended it bought in. Somewhere underneath the parking lot asphalt that nobody driving in for a game thinks twice about is the exact patch of California ground where a bartender named Naomi Filburn once told the plain truth about what was happening to her, in a room built by movie stars and closed by a spreadsheet. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button in the middle to watch more forgotten places and abandoned history from across America. Then click the video on the left to watch similar stories like this. Or if you really want to get stuck in, click the playlist on the right. New videos every week. I'll see you in the next one.